This wonderful group organized around the topic of dignity as a relational practice. We were a fairly large group, as you can see, and we considered splitting into two discussions. As it turned out, some participants were particularly interested in the structural, cultural, philosophical, and systemic influences on relational dignity, and also how to conceptualize the term relational, both the possibilities and perils of being in relationship. Other participants were most interested in dignity practices. Dignity as a verb. How do you do dignity? How do you dignify others? So we considered splitting along those lines, but then we realized that the dynamic between the political or cultural system and how we conceptualize dignity and individual action was critical to keep in mind. So here's the order of service, if you will. First, we'll hear from a couple of folks about systemic and cultural context, and also the construct of relational dignity. And I'm going to flip the page here. Then you will hear from a participant about some examples of dignity practices that we shared, the doing of dignity. Finally, I'll share a story of a dignity practice that we found exemplary, kind of an outstanding act of dignifying another. And then lastly, you'll be invited to practice an act of dignity in your own life and in your own space. Okay, so that's what we're attempting to do. So we'll start with Brian and Mecca.
So the structural issue has to do with the fact that while individuals, I think we all agree that change has to begin with the person, and with interpersonal change, that we also have larger institutional structures that have to change, and that there's a dialectic between the smaller scale change that occurs and the larger institutional change. So we just kind of noted that, and we didn't really get to talk much about those larger structural things, but we could just say that this is all happening in the context of a global capitalist economy, and we have big structures like nation states, and these things are hierarchical, and so at the same time that the micro changes, we have to think about how we change those big institutions.
And so some of us are really invested in some cultural and philosophical ideas and of decentering Western concepts. One concept that has been practiced and theorized in the global South is that of Ubuntu. In southern Africa, Zulu word, Ngoni people speaking that, and working with that practice. In Eastern Africa, it's also called Utu, right? So there's a certain Pan-African move around it, and it is moving from the egocentric, possessive individualism of dignity or human rights discourses, dignity as an object to be had, yeah, as we see in the United Nations or even in the German Constitution, to something that is a task, that is an activity, right? And so moving towards a sociocentric perspective, right? It is Ubuntu is verbalized as I am a person through other persons, or I am a human precisely because I recognize you in your humanness. And it's in another variation from East Africa, on John Mbiti specifically, we learn about I am because we are, and because we are, I am.
Do I need this? Okay. Do I need this one or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
So then we decided to get down to the nuts and bolts of how do you do dignity? How do you make a verb of it? What do you do when you wake up in the morning and do dignity? And so as we advertised, and a spoiler alert, is we're going to ask you to pick one of these or something else that you think is how to do dignity and practice it tonight. And consciously do dignity and then come back with your stories tomorrow about how you're doing it. So here they are. The first one is listening to others' voices and listening until they know they've been heard. The second one is simply intend dignity. So don't wade into something without this clear intention of dignity. The third one is humane parenting. The fourth one is integrative negotiation. In other words, all parties' needs are on the table and are explained where everybody hears all of them, and then you integrate resolutions that meet all those needs.
If I could just add to that, so it's an echo of what we heard from a previous group about not a win-lose mindset, that it's not about competition and there isn't enough to go around, but rather a model that it's possible to grow the pie and that other people's interests are equally important with yours.
And the next one is never assume. Therefore, and also, suspend any judgment. So you might say never assume, ask, and suspend judgment as the answer is coming back so that it's safe to get the answer. The next to last one is call people what they want to be called. There's a short story about this. I was describing to someone what I and my sons were doing, and she said, "Would you like a hint about that?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "When you call them my sons, there's a bit of a power imbalance there. There's a bit of a domination on my part." She said, "How about if you just call them by their name?" But then we expanded this. People will tell you what they want to be called, so ask what they want to be called. And the last one is to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Now, clearly this is not an exhaustive list, so pick one and then add one of your own if you wish, and come back tomorrow with the stories of your practice.
And for inspiration, I will, this is so awkward, I don't want to block people, but it's inevitable. So maybe as a piece of inspiration for you to see what's possible when you intend dignity. Some of you may have heard there's a program called StoryCorps where, yeah, I see lots of nodding heads. So basically, if anybody doesn't know, it's people who have the opportunity, usually dyads, two people to come in and talk to one another and record it in a semi-structured way. And it's often a chance for people to express things that they haven't expressed to one another before. So a story that I heard was about a judge in North Carolina who held a veterans court. So a lot of the people that he saw before him were veterans, mostly of Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And there was a sergeant who came before him, and the sergeant's story was pretty tragic. When he was in Afghanistan, he had done 3 tours, and he had been injured, and when he was in Afghanistan, he was in a vehicle that flipped over, went into a river, everyone else drowned, he was trapped for many hours. So he had this fear of small contained spaces, and he had evidence of PTSD. So he was dealing with some alcohol and drug issues, and he came before the court because he had violated parole, and the requirement was that he be given a night in jail. So you might think, well, wouldn't it be kind, wouldn't it be dignifying for the judge to suspend that because he knew what he'd been through? But he didn't. He assigned him that one night in jail. But what he did was, without saying anything, about an hour after the sergeant was put into his cell, the judge came downstairs and spent the whole night with him because he knew what it was like he knew what that would be for that man to be in a confined space. And the sergeant was quoted as saying, well, I heard him, said, I've never seen anyone do this. I didn't know people treated each other that way. So a small action on the part of this judge was really transformative. So that's my inspiration. So as you were encouraged, sorry?
We have a topic for tomorrow. Do you remember that?
Yeah, let me hand it over, because Spes, would you like to speak to the topic for tomorrow? Okay.
Another input that we were thinking, but the time was too short, we said, let's think about in depth the relationship between power abuse and dignity. This is the message for the world.
Okay, thank you. So this is our message, as you said, this is our message to the world.